Hello, everyone. I am so excited to join you today. My name is Daniela Fernandez. I'm the founder and CEO of Sustainable Ocean Alliance. SOA is the world's largest network of young ocean leaders looking to create ocean solutions on the for-profit and non-for-profit space. I am joined today by four leading voices in ESG, which is such an honor for me to have this conversation because there is so much happening in the climate space. There is so much happening in the investment for climate space. So I think this is a perfect time to have this discussion. So to jump right in, let me introduce this amazing panel that we have. First of all, we have Roger Martella, the Chief Sustainability Officer for General Electric. Roger, thank you for being with us today. Then we also have Alberto De Paoli, the Chief Financial Officer of Enel. Alberto, thank you for joining us. We have Anna Marie Stratov, Vice President of Risk and Compliance and Chief Risk Officer for the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. Anna Marie, thank you for being with us. And last but not least, we have Hamid Samandari, Senior Partner, McKinsey & Company. So this is the panel that we have. And as I mentioned to them earlier, I want to make sure that we have a very fun time, despite the fact that we are in Zoom boxes. And I think we're all ready to be in person again. But nevertheless, it's really exciting to be together and share this space. So let me explain a little bit about why this is really important to me personally, and also speaking on behalf of the next generation. At Sustainable Ocean Alliance, we are aiming to restore the health of our ocean in our lifetime. As lofty of a goal as that may sound, the reality is that we are running out of time. And looking at goals in 2050 or the year 2030, it's simply not something we can stand behind anymore. And the question becomes, how can we take a deep dive at these buzz phrases such as net zero and understand exactly how can we mitigate the unintended consequences of transition into a low carbon economy, and how can we make sure that there is equity across the board for communities that depend on this transition to take place. So during our session today, we're going to explore how these incredible industry leaders can ensure that the shift that we desperately need goes from being a clean energy economy that benefits people as well as the environment. And I also want to make sure that we cover what are the steps needed to make sure that we have more investment flowing into developing countries, those especially that are most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And last but not least, I want to discuss how companies are most responsible for transitioning into this new low carbon economy, and what are the risks to those businesses. So having said that, I would love to jump into our conversation. Maybe we can start with Roger. Roger, perhaps we can talk a little bit about, throughout the world, there's a lot of developing countries that are bearing this brunt of climate change. And yet these countries also rely on a lot of energy for their dependency and growth. Can you talk a little bit about what a just transition looks like for you?
Danielle, thank you very much. And thank you for that great introduction, and to you and to the economists for the invitation, the honor to join you today. And thank you for starting with this really critical question. I think you already teed it up very well in your comments when you said, this is really about people. And I think that's the best way to frame it. At the end of the day, that's why we're here, and that's why we're doing this, and that's why we're having this conversation about all the work we're doing. Sustainability is ultimately about creating the opportunity for everyone to prosper everywhere. And promoting a just transition is really the key part to that. And so General Electric thinks about this really hard. We're in 170 countries. Our equipment powers 1/3 of the world's energy. And so when we think of a just transition, what we think about, the way we define it, is we want to succeed with two goals together. The first thing we want to do, I think, is pretty obvious. We want to decarbonize the energy sector. This is critical to addressing climate change, not just for industrialized nations, but for emerging economies who want to be part of decarbonization solutions. And they're also, as you pointed out, disproportionately impacted by climate change. So we want to decarbonize the energy sector to address climate change for these people. The second part, though, is we also want to grow resiliency of energy infrastructure at the same time. There's 750 million people in the world who lack access to reliable, sustainable, affordable electricity. We want kids to turn the lights on to be able to do their homework. We want people to get access to healthcare. We want the parents to go to work and have prosperous lives. And so when we think of the just transition, we want to do both of these two things together. We want to decarbonize the energy sector and grow access to reliable, sustainable, affordable electricity. So how do we do that? Again, we think we have a pretty relevant lens here with 170 countries, 90% of the world's electricity providers use our energy. And so we want to start with the strongest possible foundation. State-of-the-art gas provides a critical backbone for energy ecosystems, but we want to build at the same time the opportunity to decarbonize gas turbines over time through hydrogen as a fuel, through carbon capture sequestration. We also want to help countries build a modernized grid through physical and digital tools. The most effective way to address increased weather events, cybersecurity, growing electricity demand, enable renewables is through having a modernized grid. And then, of course, we want to grow renewables on this system. We want, on a strong grid, to grow renewables as quickly as possible and integrate that to achieve decarbonization goals. And then the last thing is we want to innovate the breakthrough technologies of the future, like hydrogen, small modular nuclear reactors, carbon capture sequestration, not just in the United States, not just in the European Union, but in these emerging economies. We're seeing that a lot with Egypt, with COP27, the UAE with COP28, in Eastern Europe, that emerging economies want to be part of the breakthrough technology, to be part of the solution. So we're confident that this helps realize our two goals of a just transition, decarbonizing while growing access, and enabling emerging economies to be invested in the breakthrough technology of tomorrow.
So as I look at the youth leaders that we have in our ecosystem at Sustainable Ocean Alliance, we have over 7,000 youth in 165 countries. And the question I get asked all the time is, how can we hold world leaders accountable to shorter term goals, given that the year 2050 is far beyond our reach and it might be too late? So I'd love to ask this panel, how can we get to that global energy sector transition in a short-term basis, as opposed to waiting until the year 2050? Perhaps, Alberto, you can jump in.
Yes, so thank you. Good morning to you all. So I think that the question on the short term is a real question today. We are facing a lot of issues in the short term, and also so the attention is now concentrated on how to survive the winter, and so clearly, so what we can do and the transition can be overshadowed by issues sort of very short term that we are living in Europe with this gas crisis and other stuff that we are living. I think that the issue and the trend for the transition will came back reinforced by this period, but we have to take alive some relevant concept around the transition, because it's clear that now we are so puzzling ourselves if we can survive the winter and if we will have enough gas for our industry, and this is the main relevant point for the next month. But on the other side, I would stress a couple of concepts that are, I think, at the floor of everything that is pertaining the transition. For us, energy transition, is related to the attempt to electrify everything. So we think that the power will be at the base of everything in the future produced by renewable sources. This is the base. Why is something that will stay? Because this is based on sound economical reasons, not only on the willingness to save the world and to avoid a climate disaster. It's something that is relevant. But more relevant than this is that, economically speaking, is becoming the main trends of the future. So this faith, and this is clear on everything we are looking at. New technologies are based on this, and new technologies are better than the old technologies on one side. And now it's going to be reinforced by this sense of this energy independency, and also to escape from volatility of prices that now are struggling Europe because of the crisis. So I think that we will exit with a reinforced effort on a transition. And this is something that is good on itself. So I would say what is needed to take alive and to reinforce the trend of transition that has solid economic reasons to be done is now to have, on one side, all the government efforts, and we are looking at this in Europe and in the US and everywhere now. We have a huge amount of money putting in this transition. The second is to start from infrastructure, because nothing can happen if infrastructure are not ready to support such a transition. So a big flow of investments will have to go through network installments, mainly on grids, because it will be needed for the transition. And third, to have a sustainable finance, so to drive financing towards these new investments, not only because this is good for the world and for the planet that is relevant, but also because it's the best way and show how this is the best way to put the investments in the future. Because for these investments, we produce companies that will be more profitable and less risky than today's. If we take these three things together, and so we take alive the new technology and also the economical reasons to have a transition, I think that we can speed up the trend before the 2050 and exiting this crisis that we are living in Europe.
Thank you so much, Alberto. And I wonder if anyone else wants to chime in to answer that question.
Let me add a couple of thoughts. One is that it is critical to recognize now the connection between energy security and climate action. And that realization should help change the mindset around the whole issue. Of course, one has to balance short-term and longer-term risks, and there are some very critical short-term risks, but I think that recognition is very helpful. The second thing is that the situation and the acceleration needed are quite different in different parts of the world. A lot has been said about Europe. We know what is needed there, accelerating the permitting process, improving energy efficiency, rapidly electrifying the core industrial production processes, investing in having the talent that is needed. If you look at the shortages there are for qualified labor that can help with the installation of renewables, etc. But the situation is different in each region. In China, you need to create the right market mechanisms and incentives and create the right grid, because where you can produce the energy and where it needs to be consumed is very different. In sub-Saharan Africa, it is yet another situation, because you don't have the basic grid, and you need solutions that are much more local, to Roger's earlier point. So I think it's critical to recognize the link, and then what is needed by way of enabling mechanisms is going to accelerate, to be different from region to region. But in all regions, I think an acceleration is possible and desirable at this point.
Thank you, Hamid. I think the acceleration is life dependent. It's what we all require for this planet to remain livable. And I think that also a stakeholder here are government. So perhaps we can discuss the recent U.S. action on the Inflation Reduction Act and Infrastructure Act that may be seen as a precedent for climate action in other parts of the world. I wonder, Roger, if you want to chime in on that question.
Thank you, Daniela. And it's a great time to talk about this. Obviously, in August, Congress and the president have enacted the Inflation Reduction Act, which is perhaps the most significant action we've seen in the United States on climate change, particularly from Congress. And so everybody's taking it very seriously. It aims at a 40% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. The bulk of that coming from the energy sector. I think the sector that folks think is the most approachable at the earliest stage for decarbonization. And we're excited about it in the United States. There's 9 clean energy tax credits. GE intersects with all 9 of the clean energy tax credits, but we're also excited about the opportunities to use this as a template for how other countries, including emerging economies, could create climate action frameworks, as you've alluded to in your introductory comments. There's 3 kind of things, 3 elements of the Inflation Reduction Act that we think are really relevant to making it fit well with other economies, emerging economies, other parts of the world. The first is, it's a technology neutral approach. It's an all of the above approach. It's not against anything. It's all about promoting clean energy. It's about promoting breakthrough technologies like carbon capture, sequestration. And when we travel around the world, when we go to Egypt, when we go to UAE, when we go to other places, this is the theme that we hear a lot from other governments, other constituents. They want to be part of decarbonization, but they want to keep all of the above options on the table. They want to accelerate things, but they don't want to be against something at the same time. And so the Inflation Reduction Act, with the technology neutral approach, we think is a good opportunity to learn from that and to adopt that elsewhere while getting at that 40% emission reduction goals. Second is the certainty. And this goes to your last question about short-term and long-term. The short-term is key here. We have to be taking aggressive action short-term, but a lot of these investments we need are big stakes, long-term investments, and you can't make them without the long-term certainty of how things are going to play out over a few years. That's just the way the economics of some of these big stake investments work. So by having a 10-year horizon, even longer with the Inflation Reduction Act, it enables for the first time the types of big stake investments in things like offshore wind, small modular nuclear reactors that we really need to reach those decarbonization goals. So setting that 10-year horizon is really important. And then the third part of it, which we also think is relevant, is the carrots approach. Again, it's not necessarily against anything. It's not command and control. It's not a carbon price. It's going to achieve a 40% emission reduction, but do it through financial incentives. And this is another message we hear a lot when we're traveling around the world, talking to emerging economies, is they much prefer the carrots approach. And there's been lots of talk about commitments of tens of billions of dollars in climate finance from the US, from the EU, from the UK to emerging economies. And we certainly see that as a way to apply that type of climate finance to creating the types of carrots incentives here in other parts of the world to help use this as a template for bringing all the nations on board to get in climate action. So we're excited about the opportunities in the US and beyond, and look forward to working with the government and other countries to how we could implement this elsewhere.
Thank you, Roger. Hamid, do you want to chime in on that one as well?
Sure. First, I agree with all 3 points that Roger raised, particularly the neutrality, the fact that there is not a color put on the technology, but there is a wide aperture. The use of incentives, which, by the way, has been successful elsewhere as well. If you look at what has happened in renewables or electric vehicles elsewhere, it has been largely through subsidies and incentives as well. And the time horizon. So agreed with all of that. While there are things that could have been different or better, we see this also as quite positive in the sense that it will most probably have a California effect or a race to the top, in the sense that the US market is so large that it is hard to ignore, and therefore this sets de facto standards for the whole world. It is also a signal that the US is likely to redouble its diplomatic efforts within the world and advance this agenda, which would be quite positive. And the fact that the materials come from favored nations is going to, in all likelihood, catalyze action elsewhere in other countries as well. So all in all, fully agreed that it is a step in the right direction and is likely to spur further action both in the US and globally.
Thank you, Hamid. I really appreciate the response. And now I would love to transition the conversation into speaking about managing portfolio risk. Understanding and mitigating investment risk can really make the difference between a portfolio that produces outsized returns or a fund that trails and disappoints investors. So, Anne-Marie, if I can turn over to you and ask you, can you tell us about the steps the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development is taking to ensure that risk management is part of this just transition?
Thank you, Daniela, and thank you very much for having me on this panel. It's a real joy to be here, and I think also a timely moment to start to focus a little bit on developing economies. Let me first introduce the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development for those who are not so familiar with us as a multilateral development bank. originally set up in the early 90s to help build a new post-Cold War era in Central and Eastern Europe. We have since broadened our regions and are now covering more than 35 countries from Central Europe to Central Asia and the Southern and Eastern Mediterranean. Our shareholders are all global, 71 countries from 5 different continents, including also the European Union and the European Investment Bank. So how does our activities fit in with what is the topic of our discussion today, the a just transition? Let me start by saying that the just transition challenge is simply too big for any player to address alone. It requires cooperation between public and private sectors. And it's crucial not only to make sure that financing needs are met, but also to make sure that the right know-how is being brought to the table. And multilateral development banks are uniquely positioned to do just that. You look at the EU, they have substantial funding available for just transition, all sorts of funds and other windows. But looking at emerging economies, it's really, the financing is just not that available. IFIs play a role here in bringing financing both to the public sector, but also to the private sector. Even though these may not be immediately profitable in emerging markets, multilateral development banks work very closely with donors for concessional finance or to help mobilize finance from other investors. If I look very broadly at what EBRD has been doing as a mission, central to all of our activities has been from the start safeguarding the environment and commitment to sustainable energy. This is actually laid down in our environmental and social policy, which is one of our core governance and safeguarding policies in EBRD. Each project that we finance needs to meet minimum standards. And if they don't, then we will ask the client to commit to an environmental and social action plan with clear milestones and timelines set out in order to achieve those minimum standards. If we look at our region, we work in the world's most carbon intensive countries. 40% of our countries have a higher carbon intensity than the world average. And 10 of them are even in the top 20. So we need to place a very high emphasis on climate and environmental investments. So we have targeted to have a minimum of 50% of all our projects be green by 2025, and we committed last year to be fully aligned with Paris Agreement by the end of this year, by the end of 2022. But then let's look about not just opportunities, but also about risks. A very fast or rapid transition to low carbon economy creates risks not only of asset stranding and energy security, which we have just been discussing, but also employment risks in carbon intensive regions. And here's where the link to just transition is very clear. That seeks to mitigate these risks by ensuring that the substantial benefits of a green economy are shared widely and support those who stand to lose economically, be they countries or regions, industries, communities, workers, or consumers. And here's where we play a role with our green economy transition, which focuses on supporting workers and seek to help countries economically diversify. There's two elements that we bring to our countries. First of all is what we call policy dialogue, is where we engage with governments and help them integrate just transition considerations in their key climate strategy documents. But we are also on the ground and very pragmatic in that we provide technical assistance to these countries to help them with joint transition diagnostics, action plans for carbon intensive regions, and the socio-economic implications of transition. And as such, we have, for example, 3 ongoing assignments to support the governments of Serbia, North Macedonia, and Ukraine And unfortunately, the latter has now been put on hold as a result of the war. But we also support, very big energy providers in our countries of operations, and we have examples of where we finance solar PV plants, but then include also funds for reskilling the employees so that they have opportunities for the future. In all our efforts, we work very closely with international actors such as other IFIs. We work with the EU and other partners, but also international organizations like the International Labour Organization. So let's leave it at this as an introduction of our risk-based approach to just transition. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna Marie. It was so inspiring to hear all of the updates you had to share with us. And I want to emphasize the public-private partnerships point that you brought up, because it's really important for us to also know what exactly are companies doing to successfully integrate ESG and climate factors into their own risk management. And with that, Alberto, can I pass it over to you to talk a little bit about the role that companies are playing?
Well, yes. So I think we are playing a role. So on one side, I stress the fact that it's relevant, very relevant, that we may reach at the end a clear way, a standardization way to set clear targets that are fully recognized by various stakeholders around. Because we are working also at institutional level to have this standardization, but we are still living in a so different way to classify and define an ESG approach. So this standardization is needed to have a common language everywhere to show what a company is doing. What I think on the other side, on the private sector, is also to clearly link what is a set of KPI on the performance of the company related to this KPI. So it's the time to say this is a set of KPI in which I express how I'm doing on an ESG basis, and on the other side, expressing what I'm doing on a financial basis is something that has to be defined together. I give you an example on what we did. So I think so we 3 years ago we invented a new financial instruments, this SDG linked bond that now is mainstream in the sustainable finance. The very difference that we have invented is not to have a bond related to some projects, but a bond related to a specific target of the company that is based on our own and the other company strategy. Why it is different? Not only because it's a general purpose, it's not a project-linked financing. So it's a financing for the company to reach the target that is taken. But on the other side is also because the link between these two things is that the target is not only an ESG target, like, reduction of emission, but because for a company like us, reducing the emissions is related to the fact that we are increasing our profits and we are increasing the value of our company. So these two things are linked. When you can show that you are pursuing an ESG strategy, but this is not different from a strategy of growth, this is the way in which all the companies will have to express the effort in this field. I'm actively working with the UN Global Compact within the CFO coalition. We have a lot of sector, a lot of CFOs working on this. This is exactly what we are trying to do, to create good stories that are linking ESG targets with the results of the companies. I think it's relevant that this can be shown because it's the way in which other companies will follow the example and will follow the trend that we are trying to indicate.
Thank you so much, Alberto. I think it's always so critical to have role models in this space. Roger, over to you.
Well, thank you, Danielle. And I would like to pick up on Anne-Marie's comment about the public-private partnerships and the unprecedented amount of collaboration we're seeing at this point between companies, governments, NGOs, and others, reflected in the Inflation Reduction Act, cop27. other things. And Alberto's comment about the nexus between business performance and environmental performance or sustainability performance. Those are both two core themes that resonate with us and are core to how we run our sustainability programs, the partnership and the nexus. And I think to summarize it, when we think about sustainability at GE, what we want to do is, and what we are doing, is operationalizing sustainability just as we do with our businesses. We want to run our sustainability programs with the same rigor as our businesses, hold ourselves accountable for sustainability performance in the same way we hold our businesses accountable for financial performance. And I think this is all, in a trajectory of merging together. At GE, we approach it with two lenses. One, how do we contribute technology and innovation to kind of serve a public good? And second is, how do we improve our impacts as we're running our businesses and trying to do goal one? And our goal is, I think, as Alberto was pointing out, is to always align as tightly as possible our business goals and our sustainability goals. And it comes a little bit natural to us. We've always had this unique role in using innovation and technology to lift up the quality of life for people everywhere. And that gives us a real sense of purpose in this sustainability era, is how we look back at our 130-year history of how we've always used innovation to lift up people's quality of life and how relevant that is today and how that aligns to our mission. If you think about our businesses, we talk a lot about our energy businesses and leading the energy transition, a just energy transition. Our healthcare business, half of the world's population is underserved by access to healthcare. And so we're very focused on running our businesses. So we're not only introducing healthcare equipment, but we're improving the access to healthcare equipment so that those who are underserved have access through artificial intelligence, through more portable devices, and so on. And with aviation, 3 out of every 4 planes use GE engines. And aviation is critical to sustainable development goals. You want people to stay connected to their family, to economic opportunities, to their networks, to access healthcare. But they want to do it in more sustainable ways. So again, how can we be successful for our aviation business, but also be successful for sustainability? So on the one hand, we're working to align sustainability to our businesses and achieve both of those goals together. But I also mentioned the second part of what we do is, how do we improve our impacts along the way? How are we improving our impacts to our communities, to our people, and to the planet? And again, we try to run our sustainability programs with the same rigor that we do our businesses. This means if you look at our board of directors, there is engagement on sustainability issues, climate change issues, energy transition issues, every single board committee as well as the full board. With our leadership of the company, we have at least weekly rhythms where we're updating our company's top leaders on the intersection of our business goals and our sustainability goals. We have weekly calls where we bring together all our businesses and all our corporate functions together to focus on how we're improving our impact, tracking with the same rigor we do our business operations. And we look for inputs from our very front line, everybody working in our factories, on how we can address these goals together. We're going to have three independent companies here in the not too distant future. And what we want to do is we create a healthcare business, an energy business, an aviation business in this era of sustainability, is set them up with sustainability at core so that they're not only being successful for business, but they're being successful at tackling some of the world's most pressing challenges at the same time and creating those governance mechanisms on day one.
Well, Roger, it is so inspiring to hear you talk about accountability from the leadership perspective, because frankly, in society, we're asking the public to hold companies accountable, but just hearing you talk about it from the perspective of integrating sustainability in every part of your business model, I think that's the model that we need for every company to adopt. Anna Marie, how about we hear from you on any last commentary you might have around this topic, around what companies can do?
Thank you, Daniela. And I would just like to, briefly bring in that on this topic, it's not a matter of, having all these statements by companies, but increasingly companies are literally being held to account, because the stakeholders require a lot more transparency and disclosure on what exactly companies are doing and what progress they're making. In this respect, for example, reports like the TCFD report, which is the disclosure on climate-related impact that companies have, will become a method of holding companies to account. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And it's been so inspiring to just hear from all of you in terms of what companies can do and how we can truly show the world that this public-private partnership is the essential mechanism we need to progress. And now let's talk about our quest for net zero. I think that it's one of the most terrifying things that frankly keeps me up at night is thinking around how can we prevent the worst impacts of climate change as global temperatures need to be limited to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. Currently, as we all know, we are about 1.1 degrees Celsius warmer than it was in the late 1800s, and emissions continue to rise. So let's have a conversation around this transition. One of the features of these adjustments is that these impacts are going to be felt unevenly around the world. Hamid, can you talk about what does this mean for different countries, communities, and households?
Absolutely. So it is true that lower income countries such as India, Indonesia, Kenya, and those with large fossil fuel productions, think Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Russia as examples, are going to be most impacted as a portion of their GDP. Lower income countries in particular, based on our simulation, will have to spend over the next 30 years 1.5 times the proportion of GDP, their GDP, than high income countries. So it is, in that sense, quite regressive. And some of the countries like India also face huge amounts of physical climate risk. But it is not just within countries, just between countries, it's also within countries. So, for instance, if you look at the US, there are 44 counties where more than 10% of jobs are linked to fossil fuel production or other high carbon activities. So it affects differentially within countries as well. And of course, for households, there is the same regressive impact in terms of energy costs, which has been exacerbated by the current environment. Lower income households within all regions of the world are more at risk. And then there is the difference across sectors. We expect 20% of GDP to be directly affected, in the sense that companies representing 20% of the GDP are going to be in sectors that are largely linked to energy production and consumption, are going to be much more affected. Another 10% have supply chains that are quite energy intensive. So we see that unevenness across the board. And as I mentioned, in certain cases, this unevenness is exacerbated by higher physical risks as well.
And I'm curious to know, how do you see this reflected in the work that you do at McKinsey?
So the work that we do at this point is really across all sectors, and it is as much helping a major oil company doing a portfolio review of their activities and seeing where they have the opportunities for decarbonization, helping large retailers look into energy procurement, building green businesses, working with companies in emerging markets for decarb there as well. So it is not just in the developed markets, working a lot with financial institutions in terms of how they would assess the risk, but also how they would build specific new businesses to help with the transition, and a lot also with the deployment of capital. So if I look at our work, we see across geographies, across sectors, and both with respect to the management of risk and the capturing of new opportunities, a good deal of momentum and uptick across the globe.
Wow, thank you so much for sharing that. I think it just makes a lot of sense that it has to be an integrated approach. And with that, I'd love to ask a question to everyone. How does this net zero transition play out in different sectors in terms of demand, capital, production costs, and employment? And perhaps, Alberto, I can begin with you.
Yes. So in our sector, it's net zero is our big business for the future. So we are pushing on net zero. So I would say we are pushing on zero because we don't want to net nothing. We have to be zero in 2040. This is our purpose, and because it's our big way to do business. Not only it is a part of our ethical effort on climate change, is the business purpose we have. We think that we produce electricity, and we think electricity will have to be the only power of the world of the future. And on the other side, and this is what we are pushing everywhere in every field, working with our customers, but to induce the fact that customers will know the benefits in terms of economical benefits of using this only way to have power. On the other side, we are pushing because this power will be produced only by renewable energy. Why this? Because it's the cheapest way to produce energy in the world today. And it's not only the cheapest way, it's also the stable way to produce energy. Also in the crisis we are living in Europe, the only source of energy that has not increased the cost for the energy produced is the renewable one. Because the crisis in Europe is only related to the fact that the gas now is skyrocketing in prices. So for us, pushing ahead, and we have cut 10 years on our objectives of net zero, because before we had 2050, now we have 2040. It's not because because clearly we have an urgency to speed up on one side, but because we understood that if we speed up this process, we will position ourselves in the new world, and we will get more and better results than having a longer transition. So this is my 2 cents on this. When economical reason, technological reasons to do things fitting perfectly with your business model, so nothing can impede you to speed up on your purpose.
I love that, Alberto. It's truly about alignment of values, alignment with our need to survive, and also our need to protect our nature. So I really appreciated that response. Roger, can I turn over to you?
Thank you, Danielle. And just to build on what Alberto says, he talked about his role in delivering the renewable energy the world's going to need to get to net zero. Our role is innovating the technology so that Alberto was able to deliver the energy. So we approach net zero with this innovation mindset, specifically for the aviation sector and the energy sector. And those are very different sectors, very different technologies, but they have something in common, which is to get to net zero, we see a diversity of investments, a diversity of technologies. You talked earlier about the shorter term versus the longer term. We also know that we want to roll out aggressively the best technology we can today to make progress. But we also know today's technology is not enough. And in both of those sectors, we're going to need to have the breakthrough technologies for tomorrow to be successful. So just to give you an example, so for aviation, for example, some of the world's most complicated technologies. And what we're looking at there is no one technology to get to net zero, but again, a diversity of investments. So sustainable aviation fuel is probably the most accessible at the moment to decarbonize aviation. And our engines today run on sustainable aviation fuels. We've had planes run on 100% sustainable aviation fuel in one engine. The key, though, is to build that supply chain of sustainable aviation fuel. But we don't want to just rest on that. We're innovating other technologies like open rotor engines, hybrid electric engines, hydrogen engines that can run on hydrogen, because we believe the future to net zero is a diversity of options that's going to fit different purposes, different needs. And we have to be innovating this technology today, working in our labs, testing it this decade, commercializing it so we have it available for the future. And it's a very similar story for energy, as we have good technology today. We have strong renewable energy. We make, some of the world's most powerful onshore and offshore wind turbines, hydroelectricity, the world's most efficient gas turbines that are capable of hydrogen as a fuel, carbon capture sequestration, existing nuclear small modular reactors, digital and grid technology. These are tools we can use today to make progress, but we have to be thinking around the corner come 2030. What's that next generation of breakthrough technologies that we're investing in them today? So we think it's going to be a diversity of options to get us there. We don't think there's any one solution, any one type of technology, and approaching it with different types of investments, different type of approaches, we think is really key. And not stepping back or pausing on any of that, but really accelerating both the deployment of technology today, but the innovation necessary to get to net zero for the future.
Thank you, Roger. I would absolutely agree with that. And might also add the fact that we need a talent revolution across the board, and that there are so many incredible people out there, especially young people, that have these incredible ideas that don't have to be convinced that climate change is a problem, but want to act. And we need to empower them, fund them, support them to make this transition possible for them. Because we need more inventors, we need more entrepreneurs and innovators in this space to make this transition a reality. And with that being said, Anna Marie, anything to add in this?
Yeah, I think in terms of sectors, the financial services industry is going to be crucial in this whole net zero. Because they are the spider in the web. And I think that's also well recognized by regulators, because they're right on top of this, and they will be also forcing the issue. As multilateral development banks, I think we need to take a more nuanced approach, because we have a role to play to still be there as part of the transition, because we cannot all just run away from fossil fuels and drop it. So we want to actually work with all these stakeholders to advance this orderly transition, so that everybody will benefit. And so as a multilateral development bank, we will take a holistic approach to just transition, which includes risk mitigation, and particularly in these developing economies, takes into account the impact on the environment, the impact on communities, and so that we achieve a result that has a positive impact, particularly there where the impact on climate is being felt the most, and where the results are most needed. Thank you.
Thank you. And unfortunately, we are soon out of time. And not to put all the pressure on Hamid, but Hamid, I would want to ask you to maybe close out this wonderful time together by just sharing what is one thing that people that are tuning in can do to support you in your work, support the work that everyone on this panel is doing for us to ensure the successful transition into net zero.
I think there are two sets of things. One has to do with the overall mindset, and the other one with the specific actions that we can take. In terms of mindset, we need to have a degree of collaboration locally and globally that goes beyond all that we've seen in the past, and a time horizon that is different, because some of these things will take more time, even though immediate action is needed. So a different sense and notion of self-interest and discount rate. In terms of the concrete actions, I wanted to build on what Roger was saying earlier. We've looked at all the requirements for the net zero transition and categorized them in 9 categories. Actually, while technology is very important, this is the area where the greatest progress probably has been done. But we need all the supply chain, all the infrastructure, we need all the compensating mechanisms, we need the standards, etc. And what can be done, even in the short term, is to work on those building blocks, on advancing the supply chains, on advancing the mechanisms that help regulate these things, etc. For instance, you made yourself the point regarding labor. We have an enormous shortage. We've estimated in our report that you would need 200 million new jobs that would deal with a new low carbon economy. So all of these are areas in which action can be taken and should be taken, in my view, in the short term.
Thank you so much for those inspiring closing words. And I think that truly, although we are living in this era of uncertainty and there is so much at risk, we also have tremendous opportunity. We have the opportunity to innovate and disrupt every sector and to support each other in this effort. It's up to you. So I'm just grateful for all of your leadership and for being here with us today during the Economist Impact ESG and Climate Risk event. So thank you to all of our panelists, and we hope to continue working together to save our planet. So thank you all.